The royal guard found her at first light, kneeling amidst the jagged stones of the iron peaks with something small and fragile cradled against her chest. Adriana Walker didn't flinch when the ring of ironclad warriors tightened around her. She didn't raise her hands in a plea for mercy or attempt to vanish back into the shadows. Her eyes, clouded by a deep mourning tenderness, remained fixed on the tuft of white fur in her arms, a single tear tracing a path down her fair skin. "Release the prince, lone wolf." The voice that cut through the mountain gale was no mere soldier's bark. It was a resonant frequency of absolute command that seemed to make the very air vibrate with ancient authority. It belonged to Alpha King Dravener, sovereign of the northern throne and the most formidable wolf to ever wear a crown. He stepped to the center of the circle, a towering monolith of rugged power wrapped in heavy furs and battle-hardened leather. His dark hair whipped in the wind, his wolf so near the surface that his expression had already hardened into a mask of predatory grief. The legendary spear in his hand, Valen, its obsidian tip carved from the heart of the mountain and stained with the history of his bloodline, was leveled directly at her throat. Adriana's response was a mere breath against the pup's ear, a soft whisper that defied the steel. The wind howled through the jagged spires of the iron peaks, carrying with it the metallic scent of blood and the sulphurous stench of the Nocthur. Adriana didn't look back. Her boots skidded over slick, frost-coated shale, her lungs burning as she pulled the thin oxygen of the high altitudes into her chest. Beneath the heavy wool of her cloak, the small white bundle stirred, a faint, wet whimper vibrating against her ribs. "Hold on, little one," she breathed, her voice lost to the gale. "Just a little further." She had found him 2 hours ago, a splash of pristine white fur against the obsidian ruins of the old watchtower. He had been cornered by 3 shadow beasts, wraiths of smoke and obsidian claws that fed on the light of the living. Adriana was a lone wolf, a girl with no pack to shield her and no alpha to claim her. But when she saw the pup's golden eyes wide with a terror no child should know, her instinct had overridden her survival. She had driven the beasts back with nothing but a silver-tipped skinning knife and a desperate primal scream. But the Nocthur were patient. They trailed her now, dark shapes flickering between the boulders like ink dropped in water. Every time a shadow lengthened, Adriana felt the icy prickle of their malice on her skin. Her arms ached from the weight of the prince, her fingers numbing as she refused to loosen her grip. She knew these mountains. She knew that to the west lay the forbidden hunting grounds of the royal pack. To enter was to forfeit her life, but to stay in the ruins was to watch the pup's light go out. A sudden, guttural shriek tore through the air behind her. A Nocthur leaped from a ledge, its form a blur of midnight. Adriana dove forward, her shoulder hitting the frozen earth with a bone-jarring thud. She rolled, keeping her body arched protectively over the pup. The beast hissed, baring teeth made of shadow, but before it could strike again, a heavy, silver-tipped arrow hissed through the mist and took it in the throat. The creature dissolved into ash. Adriana scrambled to her knees, gasping for air, her silver-blonde hair whipping across her face in tangled ribbons. She wasn't alone. The silence that followed was heavier than the wind. From the curtain of swirling snow, shapes began to emerge, tall, lethal, and draped in the pelts of great bears. The royal guard did not approach like saviors. They approached like executioners. She felt the vibration of their footsteps before she saw them, a rhythmic thrum of armored boots against stone. They formed a seamless, suffocating circle of steel and fur. Adriana's heart hammered against her teeth, yet she remained rooted in the crimson-stained snow. She didn't raise her hands in a plea for mercy. She didn't look at the blades leveled at her heart. Her eyes, clouded by a deep, mourning tenderness, remained fixed on the tuft of white fur in her arms, a single tear tracing a path down her fair skin. "Release the prince, lone wolf." The voice that cut through the mountain gale was no mere soldier's bark. It was a resonant frequency of absolute command that seemed to make the very air vibrate with ancient authority. It belonged to Alpha King Dravener, sovereign of the northern throne. He stepped to the center of the circle, his dark hair whipping in the wind. The legendary spear in his hand, Valen, was leveled directly at her throat. Adriana looked up, her gaze meeting the king's molten stare, and her response was a mere breath against the pup's ear. "He's cold," she whispered, her voice breaking the iron silence. "And he's so very tired." Dravenor's knuckles whitened around the shaft of Valen, the ancient ironwood groaning under his grip. To his warriors, the scene was an affront to nature. A nameless, packless girl cradling the future of their lineage while shrouded in the scent of Nocthar ash. They saw a scavenger. They saw a threat. But as Dravenor took a predatory step forward, the spear's tip hovering inches from Adriana's collarbone, the air changed. It didn't smell of betrayal. It smelled of salt, rain, and a grief so profound it silenced the predatory growl in his own chest. Adriana didn't flinch at the steel. She didn't even seem to see it. Instead, she shifted her weight, bringing the white pup higher against her heart. The small creature's breathing was shallow, a wet, rattling sound that tore through the mountain silence. His eyes, once bright with royal fire, drifted open, unfocused and dim. He let out a final broken whimper, a call for a mother who wasn't there, for a king who had arrived too late to save him from the shadow venom. "I know," Adriana whispered, her voice a soft, melodic contrast to the harsh wind. "I know it hurts, little wolf, but you aren't in the dark anymore. Can you see the light?" She ignored the 20 blades leveled at her. She ignored the king's molten gold stare. Slowly, with a reverence that made the hardened warriors skip a breath, she leaned down. Her silver-blonde hair fell like a shimmering curtain around the pup, shielding him from the world's cruelty one last time. She pressed her lips to his small, velvet forehead in a long, lingering kiss, the kiss of peace. It was an ancient, forbidden mercy, a promise to a dying soul that it would not have to cross the veil alone. A single, hot tear fell from her cheek, disappearing into the pup's white fur. In that moment, the connection between them flared, a tether of pure, selfless empathy that transcended pack law and bloodlines. The pup's tension vanished. His small body relaxed into her arms, and with one final, peaceful exhale, he was still. The silence that followed was absolute. Dravenor felt it, the snap of the bond, the departure of his heir, but more than that, he felt the shattering of his own icy resolve. He had expected a killer, he found a saint. He had expected a thief. He found a girl who had walked through hell just to ensure a child didn't die scared. His hand trembled. It was a sensation he hadn't felt in a decade. The legendary spear, Valen, a weapon that had tasted the blood of giants and kings, suddenly felt like a leaden weight, a symbol of a world that was too cold, too hard, and too blind. The sound of the impact was like a thunderclap in the quiet. The obsidian tip struck the frozen stone, and the king's hand opened completely. Valen clattered into the crimson-stained snow, abandoned in the mud. Dravenor's hand moved instead to his own chest, clutching the heavy fur over his heart as if trying to hold together a soul that was cracking open. He didn't order her execution. He didn't reclaim the body with force. He simply stood there, a king stripped of his armor, staring at the lone wolf girl who had just taught a god of war how to mourn. The iron silence of the Iron Peaks was broken only by the wet, rhythmic sound of the wind whipping against the king's fur cloak. Dravenor did not move for a long moment, his hand still pressed against his chest as if the weight of the air itself had become too heavy to bear. He looked at Valen, the spear that had never before touched the dirt in anything but victory, lying discarded in the freezing mud. It looked like a relic of a man he no longer recognized. With a slow, grounding breath that turned to mist in the air, the Alpha King knelt. The movement was devoid of his usual predatory grace. It was the heavy, labored descent of a man carrying the world on his shoulders. He reached out, his massive, scarred hands trembling slightly as they slipped beneath the small, still form of the prince. Adriana's grip lingered for a heartbeat, her fingers reluctant to let go of the warmth she had fought so hard to preserve. As the weight left her arms, a visible tremor took hold of her. The adrenaline that had fueled her flight through the ruins was vanishing, leaving behind nothing but the bone-deep exhaustion of a girl who had spent her soul to save a ghost. Dravener pulled the pup against his own heart, his head bowing over the white fur. He didn't speak, but the rumble in his chest was a low, mournful vibration that made the surrounding warriors bow their heads in a synchronized wave of grief. He stood, the tiny body looking impossibly small against the vast expanse of his leather armor. "The wind is turning," Lunther, his most trusted blade, murmured, stepping closer with a hand on his sword hilt. "My king, the Nocther will return with the darkness. We must move." Dravener's golden eyes shifted toward Adriana. She stood shivering, her thin, rustic garments providing no protection against the rising blizzard. She looked fragile, a silver blonde needle in a haystack of obsidian and iron, yet she didn't ask for help. She simply stood in the shadow of the men who had nearly killed her, waiting for the sentence she assumed was coming. "Lunther," Dravener commanded, his voice raspy and weighted with a new, dark gravity. "Sire, shield her." The warriors stiffened. A lone wolf was meant to be shackled or left to the elements, not protected. But the king's gaze was a silent warning that brooked no challenge. "Unfurl your cloak," Dravener continued, his eyes never leaving Adriana's pale face. "Break the wind for her. If a single flake of frost bites her skin before we reach the stronghold, I will consider it a failure of your oath." Lunther didn't hesitate a second time. He stepped to Adriana's side, unfastening the heavy, wolfskin mantle from his shoulders. With a silent, respectful nod, he cast the thick fabric around her, creating a private sanctuary of warmth that smelled of cedar and wood smoke. He positioned his massive frame between her and the biting northern gale, his body acting as a living wall. Dravener turned toward the descent, cradling the prince with a tenderness that contradicted every legend of his cruelty. "We walk," he said, the command echoing off the stone. Together, they began the trek down from the peaks. The Alpha King led the way, carrying the burden of his grief, while the lone wolf girl walked in the center of the royal guard. No longer a prisoner, but a sacred guest protected by the very shadows she had once feared. The iron gates of the northern stronghold did not groan. They roared, a massive sound of sliding stone and heavy timber that echoed through the valley like the growl of a waking god. As the party crossed the threshold, the transition was immediate. The biting, chaotic howl of the mountain blizzard was replaced by the low, rhythmic thrum of a living fortress. Torches flickered in sconces of black iron, casting long, dancing shadows against walls that had stood since the first moon rose. Adriana walked in a daze of warmth and exhaustion, the heavy weight of Lunther's cloak still draped around her shoulders like a borrowed skin. She kept her eyes lowered, focused on the heels of Dravener's boots, yet she could feel the atmosphere in the great hall curdling as they passed. The Hall of Whispers was aptly named. Hundreds of wolves in human form lined the mezzanine and the stone pillars, their murmurs rising like the hum of a disturbed hive. The scent of the pack, a dense, suffocating mixture of pine, wet fur, and territorial aggression, pressed against her from all sides. To them, she was a puncture wound in their sanctuary. A lone wolf, a nameless girl from the fringes, was walking the hallowed path of the inner sanctum. "Look at her hair," a woman's voice hissed from the shadows. "She smells of the Nocther. Why does the king allow a scavenger to walk beside him? She isn't even shackled," a man rumbled, his eyes flashing a warning amber. "She's stained with royal blood. Look at her dress." The judgment was a physical weight, but Dravener did not slow his pace. He marched toward the center of the hall, still cradling the small, white-furred bundle against his chest. His silence was more terrifying than a roar, a cold barrier that kept the surging crowd from closing in on the girl behind him. When they reached the center of the hall, where the great fire pit roared with the heat of a dozen oak logs, Dravener finally stopped. He turned slowly, his golden eyes sweeping across the gathered pack with a lethal, shimmering intensity. The whispers died instantly, strangled by the sheer pressure of his aura. Adriana stepped out from behind Lunther's protective frame, standing exposed in the firelight. Her fair skin was smudged with soot and dried blood, her silver blonde hair a tangled mess of ice and sorrow. In the flickering light, she looked less like a threat and more like a broken blade, tempered by fire but worn thin by the world. A tall, elegant wolf with eyes like winter storms stepped forward from the inner circle. It was Salvarian, the High Elder, his face a mask of rigid tradition. He looked at the dead prince in Dravener's arms, then at Adriana, his lip curling in a subtle, dangerous sneer. "My king!" Salvarian's voice was smooth, like oil over a whetstone. "The morning rituals are prepared, but surely this creature belongs in the pits for questioning. To bring an unclaimed stray into the heart of the den is to invite the rot of the outside world." Dravener's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his scarred cheek. He didn't look at the elder. He looked at Adriana, who stood trembling under the weight of 100 hateful gazes, her hand unconsciously reaching for the leather cord at her neck. "She stays," Dravener said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the stone floor. "And if I hear another whisper of creature or stray within these walls, the next sound heard will be the snapping of the speaker's throat. She is under the king's shadow now." The atmosphere in the great hall grew thick with the suffocating pressure of ancient laws. As Dravener moved to carry the prince toward the inner sanctum, a semicircle of silver-haired elders blocked his path. These were the high lords of Salvarian, the keepers of the bloodline, and their faces were carved from the same cold marble as the fortress pillars. At their center stood Salvarian himself, his hands tucked into sleeves of heavy, dark velvet. "The king's shadow is for the pack, Dravener, not for the refuse of the Iron Peaks." Salvarian's voice rang out, stripped of its earlier oil and replaced with the steel of a formal challenge. "By the rights of our ancestors, a lone wolf found with royal blood on her hands is not a guest. She is a prisoner. She must be taken to the pits, tried by the council, and purged of whatever shadow she has brought into this house." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered lords. To them, Adriana was a contagion, a stain on the purity of their sacred territory. Adriana stepped back, her heel catching on the uneven stone. The warmth of Lundther's cloak suddenly felt like a heavy shroud. She looked at the faces of the lords, cold, unyielding, and hungry for a scapegoat to blame for the tragedy in the king's arms. Dravener did not roar. He did not snap. Instead, he turned with a terrifying, slow deliberation, still cradling the prince against his chest. He looked at Salvarian with eyes that had seen 1,000 winters and just as many wars. "You speak of purge and purity, Salvarian," Dravener said, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "You speak of the shadow she brought in. But none of you were on the peaks. None of you saw what I saw." He shifted the pup to one arm, a feat of immense strength that left his other hand free. With a gesture that was surprisingly gentle, he reached out and caught Adriana's wrist. She flinched, but he didn't let go. With a sharp, decisive tug, he pulled the heavy sleeve of her rustic garment upward, exposing her forearm to the harsh, flickering firelight of the great pit. The indrawn breaths of the high lords sounded like a collective hiss. Stretching from her wrist to her elbow were 4 deep, jagged gashes, the unmistakable talons of the Nocther. The wounds were black-edged and angry, weeping the dark, necrotic ichor that only comes from a direct struggle with shadow beasts. They were not the marks of an assassin. They were the defensive scars of a shield. "She fought them," Dravener growled, his gaze sweeping over the council until every lord looked away in shame. "She took the claws meant for my nephew. She walked 3 leagues through a blizzard with these wounds burning her blood, just to bring him home. While you were sitting by your fires discussing the purity of the bloodline, this refuse was bleeding for it." He stepped closer to Salvarian, the height difference between the Alpha King and the Elder making the latter seem suddenly fragile. "She has already been tried by the Iron Peaks and she survived. She has already been purged by the frost, and she did not break." Dravener's voice dropped to a whisper that carried to every corner of the hall. "If any of you still wish to try her, you will have to go through me first. And I promise you, my talons are much sharper than those of the Nocther." The roar of the great hall had finally faded into a heavy, watchful silence. The council had retreated into the shadows, their pride stung by the king's public defiance, leaving the central hearth to those who had actually bled on the mountain. Dravener had seen to the pup's initial rites, placing the small form in the hallowed still chamber, and now he sat by the fire pit, the flames casting long, flickering amber over his rugged features. Across from him, Adriana was a pale, luminous contrast to the dark stone. She sat on a low bench, the medicinal salves the pack healers had grudgingly provided cooling the fire in her veins. The jagged black marks of the nocther on her arms were bandaged now, white linen stark against her fair skin. For a long time, the only sound was the crackle of cedar logs and the distant, mournful whistle of the wind against the fortress battlements. Dravener watched her, his golden eyes tracking the way the firelight caught the soft, silver-blonde waves of her hair. He looked at her hands, small, calloused, yet capable of a gentleness that had leveled his world. "They would have killed you," Dravener said, his voice a low rumble that lacked its earlier edge of command. "If I hadn't arrived, the nocther would have taken you. And if I had arrived a minute sooner with my temper unchecked, Valen would have found your heart. You knew the risk of crossing into the northern hunting grounds." Adriana looked up, her expression tender and weary. Slowly, she reached up and brushed a stray, shimmering lock of silver hair back from her face, revealing the dried salt of tears on her cheeks. She didn't look like a legendary hero. She looked like a girl who had simply reached the end of her strength. "I've spent my life running, Dravener," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "As a lone wolf, you learn that the world is a series of shadows you have to navigate alone. You learn that staying is a death sentence." She leaned forward, her gaze meeting his with a clarity that made the Alpha King's wolf stir in recognition. "When I found him in the ruins, I could have left. I could have turned back toward the neutral territories and no one would have known I was there. But he didn't call for a king or a soldier or a law. He called for his mother. And when he looked at me, he didn't see an outcast. He saw someone who could hold him while he was afraid." She paused, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "I stayed because I knew what it felt like to be alone in the dark, waiting for a light that never comes. I couldn't let that be his last memory of the world. I stayed because his life was worth more than my fear of your spear." Dravener felt a sharp, electric pull in his chest. A sudden, violent realization that the bond forming between them wasn't just born of gratitude. It was a recognition of souls. He had spent his life building walls of iron and law to protect his people, forgetting that the strongest shields are forged from the very empathy he had discarded. "You are the bravest wolf I have ever met, Adriana Walker," he said, and for the first time, he used her name. Sounded like a vow. The peace of the hearth was shattered not by a sound, but by the sudden, suffocating death of the fire. One moment, the amber logs were crackling with warmth. The next, they were gray ash, as if the very heat had been sucked out of the room. A cold, unnatural fog began to seep through the floorboards, smelling of wet earth and ancient malice. "Nocther?" Adriana whispered, her eyes widening as she felt the familiar, icy prickle at the base of her neck. Before Dravener could reach for the backup steel at his hip, the alarm bells of the fortress began to toll. Not the rhythmic clang of a formal challenge, but the frantic, uneven peals of a slaughter. A messenger burst through the heavy oak doors, his face a mask of terror. "My king!" The southern nursery. The shadows, they didn't come from the gates. They're rising from the old tunnels. Dravener's wolf surged to the surface, his eyes shifting to a molten, predatory gold. "The tunnels were collapsed a century ago," he growled, already moving toward the door with the lethal speed of a true alpha. "They didn't collapse," Adriana shouted, scrambling to her feet and ignoring the flare of pain in her bandaged arms. "They're not stone tunnels, Dravener, they're vein lines. The nocther don't crawl. They flow through the salt roots beneath the mountain. Your warriors are guarding the doors, but the shadows are already underneath the pups." The king stopped, his hand on the doorframe. The traditional military logic of the northern pack was useless against a foe that ignored physical barriers. He looked at Adriana, the lone wolf, who had lived in the crevices of the world where the shadows were thickest. "Lead us," he commanded. They ran through the spiraling corridors of the stronghold, the air growing colder with every step. When they reached the nursery wing, the scene was chaos. Warriors were swinging massive broadswords at empty air, their steel passing harmlessly through the smoke-like forms of the shadow beasts. The pups were huddled in the center of the room, their small whimpers echoing the same terror Adriana had seen in the prince's eyes. "Stop fighting the air," Adriana yelled, her voice ringing with a newfound authority that made even the veteran guards pause. She snatched a decorative silver basin from a side table and hurled it into the central fire pit, which was struggling to stay lit. "They aren't shadows, they're reflections. You have to break the salt crust on the floor. That's where they're anchored." Dravener didn't hesitate. He raised his massive boot and brought it down with the force of a falling mountain. The stone floor cracked, revealing a shimmering, crystalline layer of salt root beneath. As the air hit the roots, the Nocther let out a collective, ear-piercing shriek, their forms flickering and becoming solid. "Now!" Dravener roared. With the beasts finally anchored in flesh and bone, the royal guard fell upon them with a vengeance born of the grief they still carried for Prince Nikolai. Adriana didn't stand back. She moved among the pups, her silver-blonde hair a beacon of light in the dim room, shielding them with her own body and using the silver-tipped knife she had kept hidden in her tunic to strike at the beasts that dared get too close. By the time the last shadow dissolved into ash, the nursery was silent. Not a single pup had been lost. The warriors stood panting, their eyes turning toward the girl who had seen what they were blind to. Dravener approached her, his chest heaving, and for the first time, he didn't look at her as a guest or a refugee. He looked at her as a commander. "You saved them," he said, his voice a low, reverent rasp. "You saved the future of this pack." The dust of the nursery battle had barely settled when Dravener led Adriana back into the great hall. This time, he did not walk ahead of her as a protector. He walked beside her, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back. The high lords of Salvarian had already gathered, their faces pale and drawn, sensing the shift in the mountain's very foundations. The air in the room was electric, thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy, musky pheromones of an alpha king, whose wolf had finally reached its breaking point. Salvarian stepped forward, his eyes darting to the black ichor staining Adriana's tunic. "The nursery was breached, my king. We must discuss the failures of the guard. And the only failure was yours, Salvarian." Dravener interrupted, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that silenced the room. He didn't stop until he reached the dais, turning Adriana to face the entire pack. "You clung to scrolls and ancient lineages while the shadows crawled beneath our children's feet. You looked at this woman and saw an outcast, a nameless lone wolf to be discarded. But while you were debating the purity of her blood, she was the one who saw the truth." He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently taking Adriana's. The touch was not an assertion of dominance, but a public tether. The silver blonde of her hair caught the firelight, shimmering like a halo against the dark, jagged stone of the hall. She looked up at him, her fair skin flushed with the heat of the fight, her eyes no longer clouded by mourning but bright with a dawning realization. "The old laws say a lone wolf has no place in the inner circle," Dravener continued, his gaze sweeping over the high lords until they bowed their heads. "The old laws say an alpha king must choose a mate from the high bloodlines to ensure the strength of the pack. But today I have seen a strength that no lineage can produce. I have seen a heart that fought for a pup that wasn't hers, and a mind that saved a kingdom that had rejected her." He turned fully to Adriana, his golden eyes burning with a soul-deep recognition. The bond that had been flickering between them since the Iron Peaks suddenly caught fire, a roar of primal certainty that vibrated through the floorboards. "I reject the scrolls of Salvarian," Dravener declared, his voice carrying the weight of a mountain. "And I reject the title of Lone Wolf for the woman who stands before me. She is not a servant. She is not a guest. She is the heartbeat of this fortress." He leaned in, his forehead pressing against hers in the ancient gesture of the soul bond. Adriana's breath hitched, her fingers tightening around his as the magic of the claim rippled through her. A warm, golden tide that washed away years of isolation and cold. "Adriana Walker," he whispered, loud enough for every wolf in the hall to hear. "I claim you, not as a subject but as my equal. Not as a trophy but as my mate. From this breath until the last star falls. My spear is yours, and your home is here." A single tear of joy escaped Adriana's eye, the last remnant of her old life falling away. Around them, a low, rhythmic thrum began, the sound of the warriors beating their fists against their chests in a thunderous salute to their new queen. The thaw did not come with a sudden roar, but with a quiet, persistent softening of the mountain's jagged edges. 6 months had passed since the night the shadows rose through the salt roots, and the iron peaks were finally shedding their shroud of mourning. The air, once sharp enough to cut the lungs, now carried the faint, sweet scent of pine resin and the first alpine blooms pushing through the receding frost. In the center of the royal gardens, a space once reserved for the austere training of warriors, a new monument stood. It was carved from a single block of translucent white quartz that caught the dawn light, glowing with an inner fire. It was the likeness of a small, fluffy puppy, its ears perked as if listening to a distant song. There were no lists of titles or royal lineages etched into the stone, only a single phrase in the ancient tongue: "Held in love, remembered in peace." Adriana stood before the statue, her silver blonde hair braided with small, pale flowers the pack children had brought her that morning. She was no longer the pale ghost who had stumbled into the king's circle. Her fair skin was radiant, and the haunted depth in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, steady strength. She reached out, her fingers, no longer bandaged, though the faint, silvery lines of the Nocthur scars remained, tracing the cool surface of the quartz. "He looks happy," a deep voice rumbled behind her. Dravenor stepped into the light, his massive frame shedding the heavy furs of winter for a lighter tunic of dark linen. He didn't carry Valen today. The spear remained in the great hall, a symbol of defense rather than a tool of intimidation. He came to her side, his hand finding the small of her back with a familiar, possessive warmth that made Adriana lean into him instinctively. "He is happy," Adriana whispered, looking up at her mate, "because the pack remembers him with joy now. Not just as a tragedy, but as the one who brought us together." Dravenor looked out over the battlements, where the stronghold below was bustling with life. Pups were tumbling in the grass, their yaps of excitement echoing off the stone walls. The high lords of Salvarian were no longer whispering in corners. They were busy rebuilding the trade routes Adriana had suggested, integrating the outcasts of the borderlands into the safety of the northern fold. The kingdom was no longer a fortress of iron and isolation. It was a living, breathing pack. "I spent 3 years forgetting how to feel," Dravenor said, his golden eyes softening as they rested on Adriana's face. "I thought a king's only duty was to be a wall against the dark. I didn't realize that a wall without a heart is just a tomb." He leaned down, pressing a reverent kiss to her forehead, an echo of the kiss of peace she had once given a dying cub, but this time, it was a promise of a long, shared life. Adriana closed her eyes, feeling the tether of their bond hum with a golden, unbreakable frequency. "You dropped your spear for me?" she murmured, a playful, tender smile touching her lips. "Best decision I ever made," Dravenor replied, pulling her closer as the sun finally cleared the highest peak. Together, the Alpha King and his lone wolf queen stood at the edge of the new world they had forged. Below them, the snow continued to melt, feeding the rivers and waking the earth, proving that even the coldest winter must eventually yield to the warmth of a heart that refuses to let go. We have come to the end of this video. Tell us where you are watching from in the comments, and do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the Cinem Corner channel. Thanks for watching and see you in our next video.